At times, I felt like I was failing Maureen, like I wasn't keeping my promise that I'd protect her, the promise I'd made to her when I held her on the way home from the hospital after she'd been born. I couldn't get her what she needed most: hot baths, a warm bed, steaming bowls of cream a week before school in the morning. But I tried to do little things. When she turned 7 that year, I told Brian and Lori that she needed a special birthday celebration. We knew Mom and Dad wouldn't get her presents, so we saved for months, went to the Dollar General store, and bought her a toy set of kitchen appliances that were pretty realistic. The agitator in the washing machine twisted around, and the refrigerator had metal shelves inside. We figured when she was playing, she could at least pretend to have clean clothes and regular meals. "Tell me again about California," Maureen said after she opened the presents. Although she'd been born there, she couldn't remember it. She always loved hearing our stories about life in the California desert, so we told them to her again about how the sun shone all the time, and it was so warm that we ran around barefoot even in the dead of winter, about how we ate lettuce in the farm fields and picked carloads of green grapes and slept on blankets under the stars. We told her that she was blonde because she'd been born in a state where so much gold had been mined, and she had blue eyes the color of the ocean that washed onto California's beaches. "That's where I'm going to live when I grow up," Maureen said. Although she longed for California, the magical place of light and warmth, she seemed happier than the rest of us kids in Welch. She was a storybook beautiful girl, with long blonde hair and startling blue eyes. She spent so much time with the families of her friends that she often didn't seem like a member of our family. A lot of her friends were Pentecostals whose parents held that Mom and Dad were disgracefully irresponsible and took it upon themselves to save Maureen's soul. They took her up like a surrogate daughter and brought her with them to revival meetings and to snake handling services over in Jolo. Under their influence, Maureen developed a powerful religious streak. She got baptized more than once and was all the time coming home proclaiming that she'd been born again. She once insisted that the devil had taken the form of a hoop snake with its tail in its mouth and had rolled after her down the mountain, hissing that it would claim her soul. Brian told Mom we needed to keep Maureen away from those nutty Pentecostals, but Mom said we all came to religion in our individual ways, and we each needed to respect the religious practices of others, seeing as it was up to every human being to find his or her own way to heaven. Mom could be as wise as a philosopher, but her moods were getting on my nerves. At times, she'd be happy for days on end, announcing that she had decided to think only positive thoughts, because if you think positive thoughts, then positive things will happen to you. But the positive thoughts would give way to negative thoughts, and the negative thoughts seemed to swoop into her mind the way a big flock of black crows takes over a landscape, sitting thick in the trees and on the fence rails and lawns, staring at you in ominous silence. When that happened, Mom would refuse to get out of bed, even when Lucy Joe showed up to drive her to school, honking impatiently. One morning toward the end of the school year, Mom had a complete meltdown. She was supposed to write up evaluations of her students' progress, but she'd spent every free minute painting, and now the deadline was on her, and the evaluations were unwritten. The remedial reading program was going to lose its funding, and the principal would be either furious or just plain disgusted. Mom couldn't bear to face the woman. Lucy Joe, who had been waiting for Mom in the dark, drove off without her, and Mom lay wrapped up in the blankets on the sofa bed, sobbing about how much she hated her life. Dad wasn't there, and neither was Maureen. Brian typically started doing an impersonation of Mom carrying on and sobbing, but no one was laughing, so he picked up his books and walked out of the house. Lori sat next to Mom on the bed, trying to console her. I just stood in the doorway with my arms crossed, staring at her. It was hard for me to believe that this woman with her head under the blankets, feeling sorry for herself and boo-hooing like a 5-year-old, was my mother. Mom was 38. Not young, but not old either. In 25 years, I told myself, I'd be as old as she was now. I had no idea what my life would be like then, but as I gathered my school books and walked out the door, I swore to myself that it would never be like Mom's, that I would not be crying my eyes out in an unheated shack in some God-forsaken holler. I walked down Little Hobart Street. It had rained the night before, and the only sound was the gurgle of the runoff pouring down the eroded gullies on the hillside. Thin streams of muddy water flowed across the road, seeping into my shoes and soaking my socks. The sole of my right shoe had come loose and flapped with each step. Lori caught up with me, and we walked for a while in silence. "Poor Mom," Lori finally said. "She's got it tough." "No tougher than the rest of us," I said. "Yes, she does," Lori said. "She's the one who's married to Dad." "That was her choice," I said. "She needs to be firmer, lay down the law for Dad instead of getting hysterical all the time. What Dad needs is a strong woman. A caryatid wouldn't be strong enough for Dad." "What's that?" "Pillars shaped like women," Lori said. "The ones holding up Greek temples with their heads." I was looking at a picture of some the other day thinking, those women have the second toughest job in the world. I disagreed with Lori. I thought a strong woman would be able to manage Dad. What he needed was someone who was focused and determined. Someone who would set ultimatums and stick to them. I figured I was strong enough to keep Dad in line. When Mom told me I was so focused it was scary, I know she didn't mean it as a compliment, but I took it that way. My chance to prove that Dad could be managed came that summer once school was out. Mom had to spend 8 weeks up in Charleston, taking college courses to renew her teaching certificate. Or so she said. I wondered if she was looking for a way to get away from us all for a while. Lori, because of her good grades and art portfolio, had been accepted into a government-sponsored summer camp for students with special aptitudes. That left me, at 13, the head of the household. Before Mom left, she gave me $200. That was plenty, she said, to buy food for Brian and Maureen and me for 2 months and pay the water and electricity bills. I did the math. It came out to $25 a week, or a little over $3.50 a day. I worked up a budget and calculated that we could indeed squeak by if I made extra money babysitting. For the first week, everything went according to plan. I bought food and made meals for Brian, Maureen, and me. It had been almost a year since the welfare man had scared us into cleaning the house, and it was once again an unholy mess. Mom would have a fit if I had thrown anything out, but I spent hours straightening up and trying to organize the huge stacks of junk. Dad usually stayed out at night until we were in bed, and he'd be asleep when we got up and left in the morning. But one afternoon, about a week after Mom had gone to Charleston, he caught me alone in the house. "Hon, I need some money," he said. "For what?" "Beer and cigarettes." "I've got sort of a tight budget, Dad." "I don't need much, just $5. That was 2 days' worth of food. A half-gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a dozen eggs, 2 cans of jack mackerel, a small bag of apples, and some popcorn. And Dad wasn't even doing me the honor of pretending he needed the money for something useful. He didn't argue or wheedle or cajole or ratchet the charm way up. He simply waited for me to fork over the cash, as if he knew I didn't have it in me to say no. And I didn't. I took out my green plastic change purse and pulled out a crumpled 5 and passed it over slowly. "You're a doll," Dad said, and gave me a kiss. I pulled my head back. Giving him that money pissed me off. I was mad at myself, but even madder at Dad. He knew I had a soft spot for him the way no one else in the family did, and he was taking advantage of it. I felt used. The girls at school always talked about how this or that guy was a user and how such and such a girl got used. And now I understood, from deep inside, the meaning of that word. When Dad asked me for another $5 a few days later, I gave it to him. It made me feel sick thinking how I was now $10 off budget. In a few more days, he asked for $20. $20? I couldn't believe Dad was pushing me this far. Why 20? God damn it, since when do I have to explain myself to my children, Dad asked. In the next breath, he told me that he'd borrowed a friend's car and needed to buy gas so he could drive to Gary for a business meeting. I need money to make money. I'll pay you back. He looked at me, defying me to disbelieve him. I've got bills piling up, I said. I heard my voice growing shrill, but I couldn't control it. I've got kids to feed. Don't you worry about food and bills, Dad said. That's for me to worry about, okay? I put my hand in my pocket. I didn't know if I was reaching for my money or trying to protect it. Have I ever let you down? Dad asked. I'd heard that question at least 200 times, and I'd always answered it the way I knew he wanted me to, because I thought it was my faith in Dad that kept him going all those years. I was about to tell him the truth for the first time, about to let him know that he'd let us all down plenty. But then I stopped. I couldn't do it. Dad, meanwhile, was saying he was not asking me for the money. He was telling me to give it to him. He needed it. Did I think he was a liar when he said he'd get it back to me? I gave him the $20. That Saturday, Dad told me that to pay me back, he had to earn the money first. He wanted me to accompany him on a business trip. He said I needed to wear something nice. He went through my dresses hanging from the pipe in the bedroom and picked out one with blue flowers that buttoned up the front. He had borrowed a car, an old pea-green Plymouth with a broken passenger side window, and we drove through the mountains to a nearby town, stopping at a roadside bar. The place was dark and hazy as a battlefield from the cigarette smoke. Neon signs for Pabst Blue Ribbon and Old Milwaukee glowed on the walls. Gaunt men with creased cheeks and women with dark red lipstick sat along the bar. A couple of guys wearing steel-toed boots played pool. Dad and I took seats at the bar. Dad ordered buds for himself and me, even though I told him I wanted a Sprite. After a while, he got up to play pool, and no sooner had he left his stool than a man came over and sat on it. He had a black mustache that curved around the sides of his mouth and coal grime under his fingernails. He poured salt in his beer, which Dad said some guys did because they liked to make extra foam. "Name's Robbie," he said. "That your man there?" He gestured toward Dad. "I'm his daughter," I said. He took a lick of foam and started asking me about myself, leaning in close as he talked. "How old are you, girl?" "How old do you think?" I asked. "About 17. I smiled, putting my hand over my teeth. "Know how to dance?" he asked. I shook my head. "Sure you do," he said, and pulled me off the stool. I looked over at Dad, who grinned and waved. On the jukebox, Kitty Wells was singing about married men and honky-tonk angels. Robbie held me close, with his hand on the small of my back. We danced to a second song, and when we sat down again on the stools facing the pool table, our backs against the bar, he slid his arm behind me. That arm made me tense, but not entirely unhappy. No one had flirted with me since Billy Deal, unless you counted Kenny Hall. Still, I knew what Robbie was after. I was going to tell him I wasn't that sort of girl, but then I thought he would say I was getting ahead of myself. After all, the only thing he'd done was dance me slow and put his arm around me. I caught Dad's eye. I expected him to come barreling across the room and walk Robbie with a pull cue for getting fresh with his daughter. Instead, he hollered to Robbie, "Do something worthwhile with those damned hands of yours. Get over here and play me a game of pool." They ordered whiskeys and chalked their cues. Dad held back at first and lost some money to Robbie, then started upping the stakes and beating him. After every game, Robbie wanted to dance with me again. It went on that way for a couple of hours, with Robbie getting sloppy drunk, losing to Dad, and groping me when we danced or sat down at the bar between games. All Dad said to me was, "Keep your legs crossed, honey, and keep 'em crossed tight." After Dad had taken him for about $80, Robbie started muttering angrily to himself. He snapped down the cue chalk, sending up a puff of blue powder, and missed a final shot. He flung his cue on the table and announced he'd had enough and sat down next to me. His eyes were bleary. He kept saying he couldn't believe that old fart had beat him out of $80, as if he couldn't decide whether he was pissed off or impressed. Then he told me he lived in an apartment over the bar. He had a Roy Acuff record that wasn't on the jukebox, and he wanted us to go upstairs and listen to it. If all he wanted to do was dance some more and maybe kiss a little, I could handle that. But I had the feeling he thought he was entitled to something in return for losing so much money. "I'm not sure," I said. "Aw, come on," he said, and shouted at Dad. "I'm gonna take your girl upstairs." "Sure," Dad said. "Just don't do anything I wouldn't do." He pointed his pool cue at me. "Holler if you need me," he said, and winked at me, as if to say he knew I could take care of myself, that this was just a part of my job. So, with Dad's blessing, I went upstairs. Inside the apartment, we pushed through a curtain made from strands of beer can pull tabs linked together. Two men sat on a couch watching wrestling on television. When they saw me, they grinned wolfishly at Robbie, who put on the Roy Acuff record without turning down the television. He pressed me to him and started dancing again, but I knew this was not going in a direction I wanted, and I resisted him. His hands dropped down. He squeezed my bottom, pushed me onto the bed, and began kissing me. "All right," one of his friends said, and the other yelled, "Get it on!" "I'm not that kind of girl," I said, but he ignored me. When I tried rolling away, he pinned back my arms. Dad had said to holler if I needed him, but I didn't want to scream. I was so angry at Dad that I couldn't bear the idea of him rescuing me. Robbie, meanwhile, was saying something about me being too bony to screw. "Yeah, most guys don't like me," I said. "Besides being skinny, I got these scars." "Oh, sure," he said, but he paused. I rolled off the bed, quickly unbuttoned my dress at the waist, and pulled it open to show him the scar on my right side. For all he knew, my entire torso was one giant mass of scar tissue. Robbie looked uncertainly at his friends. It was like seeing a gap in a fence. "I think I hear Dad calling," I said, then made for the door. In the car, Dad took out the money he'd won and counted out $40, which he passed to me. "We make a good team," he said. I felt like throwing the money at him, but we kids needed it, so I put the bills in my purse. We hadn't scammed Robbie, but we'd worked him in a way that felt downright sleazy, and I'd ended up in a tight spot. If Robbie had been set up by Dad, so had I. "You upset about something, Mountain Goat?" For a moment, I considered not telling Dad. I was afraid there'd be bloodshed, since he was always going on about how he'd kill anyone who laid a finger on me. Then I decided I wanted to see the guy pummeled. "Dad, that creep attacked me while we were upstairs." "I'm sure he just pawed you some," Dad said as we pulled out of the parking lot. "I knew you could handle yourself." The road back to Welch was dark and empty. The wind whistled through the broken window on my side of the Plymouth. Dad lit a cigarette. "It was like that time I threw you into the sulfur spring to teach you to swim," he said. "You might have been convinced that you were going to drown, but I knew you'd do just fine. The next evening, Dad disappeared. After a couple of days, he wanted me to go out with him again to some bar, but I said no. Dad got ticked off and said that if I wasn't going to team up with him, the least I could do was stake him some pull-shooting money. I found myself forking over a 20, and then another in a few days. Mom had told me to expect a check in early July for the lease on her Texas land. She also warned me that Dad would try to get his hands on it. Dad actually waited at the foot of the hill for the mailman and took it from him on the day it arrived. But when the mailman told me what had happened, I ran down Little Hobart Street and caught Dad before he got into town. I told him Mom had wanted me to hide the check until she returned. "Let's hide it together," Dad said, and suggested we stash it in the 1933 World Book Encyclopedia Mom got free from the library, under currency. The next day, when I went to re-hide the check, it was gone. Dad swore he had no idea what happened to it. I knew he was lying, but I also knew if I accused him, he'd deny it, and there'd be a loud yelling match that wouldn't do me any good. For the first time, I had a clear idea of what Mom was up against. Being a strong woman was harder than I had thought. Mom still had more than a month in Charleston. We were about to run out of grocery money, and my babysitting income wasn't making up the difference. I had seen a help wanted sign in the window of a jewelry store on McDowell Street called Becker's Jewel Box. I put on a lot of makeup, my best dress, it was purple with tiny white dots and a sash that tied in the back, and a pair of Mom's high heels, since we wore the same size. Then I walked around the mountain to apply for the job. I pushed open the door, jangling the bells overhead. Becker's Jewel Box was a fancy store, the kind of place I'd never had the occasion to go into, with a humming air conditioner and buzzing fluorescent lights. Locked glass display cases held rings and necklaces and brooches, and a few guitars and banjos hung on the pine board paneled walls to diversify the merchandise. Mr. Becker was leaning on the counter with his fingers interlocked. He had a stomach so big that his thin black belt reminded me of the equator circling the globe. I was afraid that Mr. Becker wouldn't give me the job if he knew I was only 13, so I told him I was 17. He hired me on the spot for $40 a week in cash. I was thrilled. It was my first real job. Babysitting and tutoring and doing other kids' homework and mowing lawns and redeeming bottles and selling scrap metal didn't count. $40 a week was serious money. I liked the work. People buying jewelry were always happy, and even though Welch was a poor town, Becker's Jewel Box had plenty of customers. Older miners buying their wives a mother's pin, a brooch with a birthstone for each of her children. Teenage couples shopping for engagement rings, the girl giggling with excitement, the boy acting proud and manly. During the slow spells, Mr. Becker and I watched the Watergate hearings on a little black and white TV. Mr. Becker was captivated by John Dean's wife, Maureen, who sat behind her husband while he was testifying and wore elegant clothes and pulled her blonde hair back in a tight bun. "Hot damn, that's one classy broad," Mr. Becker would say. Sometimes after watching Maureen Dean, Mr. Becker got so randy that he came behind me while I was cleaning the display case and rubbed up against my backside. I'd pull his hands off and walk away without saying a word, and that horn dog would return to the television as if nothing had happened. When Mr. Becker went across the street to the Mountaineer Diner for lunch, he always took the key to the display case that held the diamond rings. If customers came in wanting to look at the rings, I had to run across the street to get him. Once he forgot to take the key, and when he returned, he made a big point of counting the rings in front of me. It was his way of letting me know he didn't trust me in the slightest. One day, after Mr. Becker had come back from lunch and ostentatiously checked the display cases, I was so furious that I looked around to see if there was anything in the entire darn store worth stealing. Necklaces, brooches, banjos, none of them did anything for me. And then the watch display caught my eye. I had always wanted a watch. Unlike diamonds, watches were practical. They were for people on the run, people with appointments to keep and schedules to meet. That was the kind of person I wanted to be. Dozens of watches ticked away in the counter behind the cash register. There was one in particular that made me ache. It had 4 different colored bands, black, brown, blue, and white, so you could change your watch band to match your outfit. It had a price tag of $29.95, $10 short of a week's salary. But if I wanted, it could be mine in an instant, and for free. The more I thought about that watch, the more it called to me. One day, the woman who worked at the store Mr. Becker owned and wore stopped by. Mr. Becker wanted her to give me some beauty tips. While she was showing me her different makeup applicators, the woman, who had stiff platinum hair and eyelashes tarred in mascara, told me I must be earning a truckload in commissions. When I asked her what she meant, she said that in addition to her $40 a week salary, she made 10% on every sale. Her commissions were sometimes double her salary. "Hell, welfare'll get you more than $40 a week," she said. "If you're not getting commissions, Becker's stiffing you." When I asked Mr. Becker about commissions, he said they were for salespeople, and I was just an assistant. The next day, when Mr. Becker went off to the Mountaineer, I opened the display case and took out the 4-band watch. I slipped it into my handbag and rearranged the remaining watches to cover the gap. I made plenty of sales on my own when Mr. Becker was busy. Since he hadn't paid me any commissions, I was only taking what I was owed. When Mr. Becker came back from lunch, he studied the diamond ring display like he always did, but he didn't even glance at the watches. Walking home that evening with a watch hidden in my purse, I felt light and giddy. After dinner, I climbed into my bunk bed, where no one could see me, and tried on the watch with each of the bands, gesturing the way I figured rich people did. Wearing the watch to work was out of the question, of course. I also realized that I could run into Mr. Becker in town at any time, so I decided that until school started, I'd put the watch on only at home. Then I began to wonder how I'd explain the watch to Brian and Lori and Mom and Dad. I also worried that Mr. Becker might see something thief-like in my expression. Sooner or later, he'd discover the missing watch and would question me, and I'd have to lie convincingly, which I wasn't very good at. If I wasn't convincing, I'd be sent off to a reform school with people like Billy Deal, and Mr. Becker would have the satisfaction of knowing he'd been right all along not to trust me. I wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. The next morning, I took the watch out of the wooden box where I kept my geode, put it in my purse, and brought it back to the store. All morning, I nervously waited for Mr. Becker to leave for lunch. When he was finally gone, I opened the display case, slipped the watch inside, and rearranged the other watches around it. I moved fast. The week before, I had stolen the watch without breaking into a sweat, but now I was terrified that someone would catch me putting it back. In late August, I was washing clothes in the tin pan in the living room when I heard someone coming up the stairs singing. It was Lori. She burst into the living room, duffel bag over her shoulder, laughing and belting out one of those goofy summer camp songs kids sing at night around the fire. I'd never heard Lori cut loose like this before. She positively glowed as she told me about the hot meals and the hot showers and all the friends she'd made. She even had a boyfriend who kissed her. Everyone assumed I was a normal person, she said. It was weird. Then she told me that it had occurred to her that if she got out of Welch and away from the family, she might have a shot at a happy life. From then on, she began looking forward to the day she'd leave Little Hobart Street and be on her own. A few days later, Mom came home. She seemed different, too. She had lived in a dorm on the university campus, without 4 kids to take care of, and she had loved it. She'd attended lectures and she'd painted. She'd read stacks of self-help books, and they had made her realize that she'd been living her life for other people. She intended to quit her teaching job and devote herself to art. "It's time I did something for myself," she said. "It's time I start living my life for me." "Mom, you spent the whole summer renewing your certificate." "If I hadn't done that, I never would have had this breakthrough." "You can't quit your job," I said. "We need the money." "Why do I always have to be the one who earns the money?" Mom asked. "You have a job. You can earn money. Lori can earn money too. I've got more important things to do." I thought Mom was having another tantrum. I assumed that come opening day, she'd be off in Lucy Joe's Dart to Davie Elementary, even if we had to cajole her. But on the first day of school, Mom refused to get out of bed. Lori Braun and I pulled back the covers and tried to drag her out, but she wouldn't budge. I told her she had responsibilities. I told her child welfare might come down on us again if she wasn't working. She folded her arms across her chest and stared us down. "I'm not going to school," she said. "Why not?" I asked. "I'm sick." "What's wrong?" I asked. "My mucus is yellow," Mom said. If everyone who had yellow mucus stayed home, the schools would be pretty empty, I told her. Mom's head snapped up. "You can't talk to me like that," she said. "I'm your mother." "If you want to be treated like a mother," I said, "you should act like one." Mom rarely got angry. She was usually either singing or crying, but now her face twisted up with fury. We both knew I had crossed a line, but I didn't care. I had also changed over the summer. "How dare you!" she shouted. "You're in big trouble now. Big trouble. I'm telling your dad. Just you wait until he comes home." Mom's threat didn't worry me. The way I saw it, Dad owed me. I'd looked after his kids all summer. I'd kept him in beer and cigarette money, and I'd helped him fleece that miner Robbie. I figured I had Dad in my back pocket. When I got home from school that afternoon, Mom was still curled up on the sofa bed, a small pile of paperbacks next to her. Dad was sitting at the drafting table, rolling a cigarette. He beckoned me to follow him into the kitchen. Mom watched us go. Dad closed the door and looked at me gravely. "Your mother claims you back-talked her." "Yes," I said, "it's true." "Yes, sir," he corrected me. But I didn't say anything. "I'm disappointed in you," he went on. "You know damn good and well that you are to respect your parents." "Dad, Mom's not sick. She's playing hooky," I said. "She has to take her obligations more seriously. She has to grow up a little." "Who do you think you are?" he asked. "She's your mother. Then why doesn't she act like one?" I looked at Dad for what felt like a very long moment. Then I blurted out, "And why don't you act like a dad?" I could see the blood surge into his face. He grabbed me by the arm. "You apologize for that comment." "Or what?" I asked. Dad shoved me up against the wall. "Or by God, I'll show you who's boss around here." His face was inches from mine. "What are you going to do to punish me?" I asked. "Stop taking me to bars?" Dad drew back his hand as if to smack me. You watch your mouth, young lady. I can still whip your butt, and don't think I won't. You can't be serious, I said. Dad dropped his hand. He pulled his belt out of the loops on his work pants and wrapped it a couple of times around his knuckles. Apologize to me and to your mother, he said. No. Dad raised the belt. Apologize. No. Then bend over. Dad was standing between me and the door. There was no way out except through him. But it never occurred to me to either run or fight. The way I saw it, he was in a tighter spot than I was. He had to back down, because if he sided with Mom and gave me a whipping, he would lose me forever. We stared at each other. Dad seemed to be waiting for me to drop my eyes, to apologize and tell him I was wrong, so we could go back to being like we were. But I kept holding his gaze. Finally, to call his bluff, I turned around, bent over slightly, and rested my hands on my knees. I expected him to turn and walk away, but there were 6 stinging blows on the backs of my thighs, each accompanied by a whistle of air. I could feel the welts rising even before I straightened up. I walked out of the kitchen without looking at Dad. Mom was outside the door. She'd been standing there listening to everything. I didn't look at her, but I could see from the corner of my eye her triumphant expression. I bit my lips so I wouldn't cry. As soon as I got outside, I ran up into the woods, pushing tree branches and wild grapevines out of my face. I thought I'd start crying now that I was away from the house, but instead I threw up. I ate some wild mint to get rid of the taste of bile, and I walked for what felt like hours through the silent hills. The air was clear and cool, and the forest was thick with leaves that had fallen from the buckeyes and poplars. Late in the afternoon, I sat down on a tree trunk, leaning forward because the backs of my thighs still stung. All through the long walk, the pain had kept me thinking, and by the time I reached the tree trunk, I had made 2 decisions. The first was that I had had my last whipping. No one was ever going to do that to me again. The second was that, like Lori, I was going to get out of Welch. The sooner the better. Before I finished high school, if I could. I had no idea where I would go, but I did know I was going. I also knew it would not be easy. People got stuck in Welch. I had been counting on Mom and Dad to get us out, but I now knew I had to do it on my own. It would take saving and planning. I decided the next day I'd go to G.C. Murphy and buy a pink plastic piggy bank I'd seen there. I'd put in the $75 I'd managed to save while working at Becker's Jewel Box. It would be the beginning of my escape fund. That fall, 2 guys showed up in Welch who were different from anyone I'd ever met. They were filmmakers from New York City, and they'd been sent to Welch as part of a government program to bring cultural uplift to rural Appalachia. Their names were Ken Fink and Bob Gross. At first, I thought they were joking. Ken Fink and Bob Gross? As far as I was concerned, they might as well have said their names were Ken Stupid and Bob Ugly. But Ken and Bob weren't joking. They didn't think their names were funny at all. And they didn't smile when I asked if they were putting me on. Ken and Bob both talked so fast, their conversations filled with references to people I'd never heard of, like Stanley Kubrick and Woody Allen, that it was sometimes hard to follow them. Although they had no sense of humor about their names, Ken and Bob did like to joke a lot. It wasn't the sort of Welch high humor I was used to, Pollock jokes and guys cupping their hands under their armpits to make fart noises. Ken and Bob had this smart, competitive way of joking where one would make a wisecrack and the other would have a comeback, and the first would have a retort to the comeback. They could keep it up until my head spun. One weekend, Ken and Bob showed us a Swedish film in the school auditorium. It was shot in black and white and had subtitles and a plot heavy on symbolism, so fewer than a dozen people came, even though it was free. Afterward, Lori showed Ken and Bob some of her illustrations. They told her she had talent and said if she was serious about becoming an artist, she needed to go to New York City. It was a place of energy and creativity and intellectual stimulation, the likes of which we'd never seen. It was filled with people who, because they were such unique individuals, didn't fit in anywhere else. That night, Lori and I lay on our rope beds and discussed New York City. The things I'd always heard about it made it sound like a big, noisy place with a lot of pollution and mobs of people in suits elbowing one another on the sidewalks. But Lori began to see New York as a sort of emerald city, this glowing, bustling place at the end of a long road where she could become the person she was meant to be. What Lori liked most about Ken and Bob's description was that the city attracted people who were different. Lori was about as different as it was possible to be in Welch. While almost all the other kids wore jeans, Converse sneakers, and T-shirts, she showed up at school in army boots, a white dress with red polka dots, and a jean jacket with dark poetry she'd painted on the back. The other kids threw bars of soap at her, pushed one another into her path, and wrote graffiti about her on the bathroom walls. In return, she cursed them out in Latin. At home, she read and painted into the night, by candlelight or kerosene lamp if the electricity was turned off. She liked Gothic details, mist hanging over a silent lake, gnarled roots heaving up from the earth, a solitary crow in the branches of a bare tree on the shoreline. I thought Lori was amazing, and I had no doubt she would become a successful artist, but only if she could get to New York. I decided I wanted to go there too, and that winter we came up with a plan. Lori would leave by herself for New York in June after she graduated. She'd settle in, find a place for us, and I'd follow her as soon as I could. I told Lori about my escape fund, the $75 I'd saved. From now on, I said, it would be our joint fund. We'd take on extra work after school and put everything we earned into the piggy bank. Lori could take it to New York and use it to get established, so that by the time I arrived, everything would be set. Lori had always made very good posters for football rallies, for the plays the drama club put on, and for candidates running for student council. Now she started doing commissioned posters for $1.50 apiece. She was too shy to solicit orders, so I did it for her. Lots of kids at Welch High wanted customized posters to hang on their bedroom walls, of their boyfriend's or girlfriend's name, of their car or astrological sign, or their favorite band. Lori designed the names in big, fat, overlapping three-dimensional letters like the kind on rock albums, then painted them in day-glow colors, outlined in India ink so the letters popped, and surrounded them with stars and dots and squiggly lines that made the letters seem like they were moving. The posters were so good that word of mouth spread, and soon Lori had such a backlog of orders that she was up working until 1 or 2 every morning. I made money babysitting and doing other kids' homework. I did book reports, science essays, and math. I charged $1 per assignment and guaranteed at least an A-, or the customer was entitled to a full refund. After school, I babysat for $1 an hour and could usually do the homework then. I also tutored kids for $2 an hour. We told Brian about the escape fund, and he pitched in, even though we hadn't included him in our plans because he was only in 7th grade. He mowed lawns or chopped wood or cut hillside weeds with a scythe. He worked after school until the sun went down and all day Saturday and Sunday, and came home with his arms and face scratched from the brush he'd cleared. Without looking for thanks or praise, he quietly added his earnings to the pig, which we named Oz. We kept Oz on the old sewing machine in the bedroom. Oz had no plugged hole on the bottom, and the slot on the top was too narrow to work bills out, even if you used a knife. So once you'd put money in Oz, it stayed there. We tested it to make sure. We couldn't count the money, but because Oz was translucent, we could see our cash accumulating inside when we held him up to the light. One day that winter, when I came home from school, a gold Cadillac Coupe de Ville was parked in front of the house. I wondered if the welfare agency had found some millionaires to be our foster parents, and they had arrived to take us away. But Dad was inside the house, twirling a set of keys on his finger. He explained that the Cadillac was the new official Walls family vehicle. Mom was carrying on about how it was one thing to live in a 3-room shack with no electricity, since there was a certain dignity in poverty. But to live in a 3-room shack and own a gold Cadillac meant you were bona fide poor white trash. "How'd you get it?" I asked Dad. "One hell of a good poker hand," he said, "and an even better bluff." We'd owned a couple of cars since we'd been in Welch, but they were true buckets of bolts, with shuddering engines and cracked windshields, and as we drove along we could see the blur of the asphalt through the rusted-out floor panels. Those cars never lasted more than a couple of months, and like the Oldsmobile we'd driven from Phoenix, we never named them, much less got them registered and inspected. The Coupe de Ville actually had an unexpired inspection sticker. It was such a beauty that Dad declared the time had come to revive the tradition of naming our cars. "That there caddy," he said, "strikes me as Elvis." It crossed my mind that Dad ought to sell Elvis and use the money to install an indoor toilet and buy us all new clothes. The black leather shoes I had bought for 50 cents at the Dollar General store were held together with safety pins, which I'd tried to blacken with a magic marker so you wouldn't notice them. I'd also used magic markers to make colored blotches on my legs that I hoped would camouflage the holes in my pants. I figured that was less noticeable than if I sewed on patches. I had one blue pair and one green pair, so my legs, when I took my pants off, were covered with blue and green spots. But Dad loved Elvis too dearly to consider selling it. And the truth was, I loved Elvis almost as much. Elvis was long and sleek as a racing yacht. It had air conditioning, gold shag upholstery, windows that went up and down with a push of a button, and a working turn signal, so Dad didn't have to stick his arm out. Every time we drove through town in Elvis, I'd nod graciously and smile at the people on the sidewalk, feeling like an heiress. "You've got true noblesse oblige, mountain goat," Dad would say. Mom grew to love Elvis too. She hadn't gone back to teaching, and instead spent her time painting, and on the weekends we began to drive to craft fairs all throughout West Virginia. Shows where bearded men in overalls played dulcimers and women in granny dresses sold corncob back scratchers and coal sculptures of black bears and miners. We filled Elvis's trunk with Mom's paintings and tried to sell them at the fairs. Mom also drew pastel portraits on the spot for anyone willing to pay $18, and every now and then she got a commission. We all slept in Elvis on those trips, because a lot of times we made only enough to pay for the gas, or not even that. Still, it felt good to be on the move again. Our trips in Elvis reminded me how easy it was to pick up and move on when the urge struck. Once you'd resolved to go, there was nothing to it at all.